Hi, my name is Tom Hogan, and I am here with Matt Eisenhammer today, and we're going to talk about some Cub baseball. So, Matt and I been friends for 20 some years, been going to Cubs games that whole time, and we feel pretty invested in this team. The championship season of a couple of years ago, a nice long sustained stretch of success that the team enjoyed. We even attended a playoff game together a couple of years ago. We really feel invested in this team. And now we're seeing the team being taken apart. So, Matt, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you think is going on in the head of the Cubs management, general manager right now?
I have to believe that ownership has said, we're not clear on what baseball looks like in 2021 with COVID protocol, with who's going to be in the stands, with the amount of money that can be fully made. And yes, they've got the marquee network and they've got money coming in, but I think they truly believe they don't know what to expect and they're trying to dump money any way they can.
Oh, I agree. And, to just very briefly touch on the procedural side of this, you've seen the governor of Illinois just last week extend out for 150 days their emergency measures. So it's a very real possibility there may not be stands in the fan again this year. You may not see gate revenue, merchandising revenue, beer and pizza revenue, brats being sold at the stadium. All that's not even necessarily on the table right now. And so you believe that that's a financial aspect that's driving this decision?
Absolutely. And because there's things you've got to think about, right? So as an example, where in the standings did the Cubs finish last year?
Well, they finished in first place in their division.
And they absolutely did, right?
If I were to pull up the standings, I could tell you that in comparison with the rest of Major League Baseball, their standing might not have been quite so dramatic. We see that the Cubs finished the season with 34 wins, and that was actually the lowest total of any division winner last season.
And I think what you have seen, this is not suddenly new. The Ricketts family have been putting brakes on the car. They would tell you, look, we brought John Lester into Chicago. We brought
Jason Hayward,
Ben Zobrist to Chicago, Jason Hayward, Darvish. We've spent the money. The money is on the field.
Yes.
And so there aren't more big name signings, and you've seen that for 3 straight seasons where they've limped along, making $1 million moves, not multi-million-dollar moves, bringing in bullpen help. And yeah, they've made some mid-season moves, but last year probably being the most prime example. The All-Star break came and Cameron Maybin was the big move, and then I think there was a Arizona Diamondback pitcher that came in, right?
So
you've seen them slowing down significantly.
So this brings up a great question. Is this a rebuild? Is it a fire sale? Is the pearl clutching and hand wringing on social media, is that all warranted that's going on right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lack of trust with the fans to believe that we're not headed back to the many, many years of miserable Cub baseball.
Well, and that's what we grew up watching, right?
Certainly, right? So this isn't, Cub fans' patience was finally rewarded as they watched Theo and Jed come in and say, yeah, we're gonna do this. Trust the process. Give us some time. It's gonna be painful. It's gonna hurt. We're gonna get there. And they did. And they built the core and they signed free agents and they built that winner. But what you're seeing right now, I think, is a trust us. And the fans are saying, wait, you've raised the prices on tickets, and you've built your network, and you've built your stadium, and where's the money going? Because we've got money to do some things that we're not doing. And then not only did they trade, and we're going to get to this, they trade Darvish. They let some players walk, but then you would expect, sweet, we freed up money to go get the right players. And that's not what you're seeing. You're seeing a whole lot of bad execution in what you might normally consider rebuild efforts. And it doesn't seem to have much of a payoff.
Yeah, I agree. So let's get into a few of these transactions that have transpired here in the last 2 months. There are 4 names that stand out to me that have departed the Cubs by various means. John Lester had his contract option declined. Kyle Schwarber was non-tendered. Quintana was, to my knowledge, never offered an extension. He was just allowed to walk. And then Yu Darvish being traded to the Padres along with Victor Caratini. So start out with Lester, because he's the one, right? This is the guy that was brought in, and he was going to usher in a new era of successful Cub baseball. So talk about Lester a little bit for me.
I don't think Lester not re-signing with the Cubs is surprising in itself. He's not the guy that he was when we obviously brought him in, at the beginning of 2015. But what is a surprise was how badly John wanted to retire as a Cub and stay with the team, and made it very clear that he was willing to take a deal very close to what he ended up taking with the Nationals. And so for $4 million a year to slot him in as the 5th starter with what we're currently going to run out in 2021, it's hard to believe that we didn't bring Lester back, who is probably the best free agent signing in the history of the Chicago Cubs.
Somewhere Andre Dawson is going to start knocking on the door and demanding his way into this podcast here pretty soon. But I'm willing to concede your point for the moment.
I don't think it does us any favors to go into John Lester's stats, but I'll just say this. He has a Chicago Cub career playoff ERA of 2.51.
Yes.
I don't think there's anybody who's led to more playoff baseball in Chicago. That's not maybe saying much.
No. I mean, Dawson made a playoff appearance. One. So for whatever it's worth. So, all right. So Lester is gone. And again, this seems to point to more of the fire sale versus rebuild, where they weren't even willing to talk to him about a reasonable 1-year deal, right? The next one is Schwarber. And Schwarber, quite frankly, Schwarber has urban legend status. The man hit the greatest home run on top of the highest scoreboard that anyone's ever seen at Wrigley Field. I mean, short of hitting the top of the center field scoreboard, which you can't physically do with a baseball, I don't think. But Schwarber put a home run in a critical game in an important moment, deposited a home run as far as anyone had ever seen. And then the next year, missed almost the whole year, came back and played in the World Series and contributed in a meaningful way. And so absolutely, Schwarber is a guy that you look at and you say, this is a fan favorite. This is a guy that's going to bring people to the stadium. But of course, as we talked about with COVID, maybe it doesn't matter if we bring people to the stadium, but they still brings eyeballs, even if it's to the TV set. So Schwarber leaving, going to Washington along with Lester, seems to smack of a departure from the way things have been done previously.
I don't think it's keeping me up at night that Schwarber won't be a Cub in 2021. Yes, the man has a 12-foot axe and a blue ox, then would walk around Chicago with prolific fame. But that's a guy who has been made for the DH spot, right? And the downside is there've been plenty of times where the Cubs had offers to move Schwarber, and they said no, he's going to be the guy. And I think they waited on him for a long time. They certainly looked at his 2019 second half stats and said, he's finally here. Kyle Schwarber's here. He'll get on base. He'll hit massive home runs, and we'll tolerate the left field defense. And I think, they banked on him. They didn't go with Castellanos, and it did not pan out in 2020.
So I'm going to ask you a theoretical question here. Who would you rather have in left field, Schwarber or Soriano? Can you hear Steve Stone's voice right now talking about Soriano out in left again?
As he said, these are the problems you have when your DH is playing left field.
That's right. That's right.
I think Schwarber does not have, it's funny. I think Schwarber did more with what he had, and Soriano did less with what he had.
That's fair. That's fair. Schwarber was absolutely an overachiever. Yes.
While we're talking about it, so they're moving Schwarber to, they've let him walk. They really don't have his replacement.
No.
They're going to clearly spend a lot of time with Bodie in left, but I just don't see how he's an everyday player.
Right.
And so yeah.
As much as you want to say Schwarber is some kind of a natural DH, he signed with the Nationals, where he's going to have to still go out and play a defensive position somewhere on the infield or on the outfield. So
yeah, agreed.
Yeah, moving on from Schwarber now, we have the Yu Darvish trade. The Yu Darvish trade is easily the biggest move that the Cubs made in this offseason. Darvish and Caratini being traded to the San Diego Padres and bringing back Zach Davies and a bunch of minor leaguers that are not really highly regarded. So give me some thoughts on this trade and is this really the harbinger of what's going on in Cub world right now?
I think if you're trying to give the Cubs some props and say, look, Darvish is clearly more valuable at this point in his career than he's been in certainly 5 years. He's coming off of 2 really strong pitching years of pitching performance, won a Cy Young, I believe. And now's the time to cash in and say, the players we get in this deal, they're going to be the core of what this team looks like in 2023. Okay. I think that's a possibility, but that's not what they got. They got Zach Davies and none of their top prospects, the Padres prospects. So then you're thinking, and not only that, but they gave away Caratini, who plays a great backup catcher and first base, and was not making any sort of serious money. Well, and so now you're thinking, okay, so then the appropriate thing you might think is, we're going to take that $20 million savings and use it to sign that bat that we think is going to shore up the offense that has not really shown up in 2018, 2019, or 2020. But I don't expect that's what you're going to see in the next 2 months.
Well, and the Caratini thing, there has been kind of a vignette to this where Caratini is kind of the personal catcher for Darvish, and it was actually a stipulation that he was going to come along with Darvish to San Diego. So I wonder how much the Cubs had a real option in that. In order to get rid of Darvish's contract, Caratini had to go along with it. So I don't know if that's an entirely fair assessment. But I will say, I wish that the Cubs had made their trade a couple days earlier, because when the Rays traded Snell for Patino, that was the guy that you wanted out of the Padres system. And he's in Tampa now.
Agreed.
Yeah, that was the one where I looked at it and thought, man, I wish they had made this trade a day earlier. I wish they had gotten that prospect instead of the ones that they actually ended up with. So moving on now, this one is going to fly a little under the radar for most people, but Jose Quintana was allowed to walk as a free agent. Now, Quintana had some success as a Cub. He certainly wasn't as beloved as some of these other players. But the reason I bring this up is because of what we gave up to bring in Quintana at the trade deadline a couple of years ago. And he was adequate. He was a good starter, and he did help on the playoff push. But what we gave up to bring him in seems like an awful, awful steep trade right now.
Well, do you recall what we traded for Quintana?
Well, the one piece that's going to come back and haunt him is absolutely Eloy Jimenez. And I don't remember the other players involved in that trade. But Jimenez looks like he's going to turn out to be a monster.
I believe we gave up Dylan Cease.
Oh, him as well?
Yes.
So that's a pitcher and an outfielder that we could probably really use in a rebuild right now. So what are your thoughts on that?
You know, I would tell you that it's what we thought we had to do in 2017 to make the playoffs. And maybe that is what got us back to, the NL, championship series against the Dodgers. But if you look at Quintana's stat lines, he was 13-11 with a 4.03 ERA in 2018. I mean, that seems kind of league average. That slipped to 13-9 with a 4.68 ERA in 2019. And then, led to basically a lost season for him in 2020. And I think this will be one of the deals that Epstein made that will always be his worst.
Yeah. So you're right. Jimenez and Dylan Cease were both in that trade. They were ranked number 8 and number 63 prospects in Major League Baseball at the time of the deal. And man, Rick Hahn has just got to be patting himself on the back right now. But anyway, we'll move on from that. Is there any other transactions that have caught your attention? Any other players that departed or came on that really stand out to you from this offseason?
I don't think anything that will impact us. Obviously, Almora was allowed to walk, and that's more of an emotional connection than anything else, because I don't think that he was ever a full-time player.
Okay. So moving along, let's talk now about what the opening day Cub lineup and rotation are going to look like. Because in the immediate future, it appears that the rotation is going to be some combination of Kyle Hendricks, who's clearly still a holdover, Zach Davies, acquired in the Darvish trade, Alec Mills, Mr. No-Hitter himself, and Adbert Alzolay being brought up from Iowa, Tyson Miller, and Braylon Marquez. And out of those 6, I'm assuming you're going to find 5 starting pitchers in the upcoming Cub pitching staff.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's the possibility that they think that Shelby Miller can pitch, but it's been a long time since Shelby Miller had any level of success, and it's been 2016 since Shelby Miller even threw 100 innings.
Right. He has not carried a starter's workload in the last 5 seasons. So then we look at the Cubs bullpen. We see that Craig Kimbrell is coming back, and you've got some setup guys out here, Rowan Wick, Brad White, Kyle Ryan, Dwayne Underwood, some familiar names, Dylan Maples from last year, Justin Steele. There's definitely some holdovers in the bullpen. I mean, none of these guys seem particularly overwhelming, and Kimbrell certainly needs to rediscover that closer magic from his days in Atlanta. So how do you feel about the Cub bullpen?
Missing from that list is Jeffress, who was really who the Cubs were using in a closing capacity at the end of that season.
And he's just,
I think a lot of this is going to be, duct tape. Um, if you think about going up against the Dodgers or the Nationals or even the Cardinals in a playoff series, how do you feel about Hendricks and Davies and Mills as your top three? And that's it's missing a name.
Yeah. Or a couple names. I mean, the Cubs allowed 60% of their rotation to leave or be traded away in this offseason.
So I could live in a world where Mills is your 5 and Alzolay is your 4 and maybe even Davies as your 3. But when you push Hendricks to a number 1 role, that's rough. Hendricks has never been in an All-Star game.
Right.
He's been a fine, reliable starter. But it's a little wild to think of him as your number 1.
Yeah. So let's look around the diamond at the Cubs' defensive alignment as it would appear to be set up right now, with Contreras being the catcher, Rizzo at first, Horner at second, or Horner at short, and Bodie at second, some combination of those in the middle infield, and Bryant over at third, Baez obviously still, assuming that nobody gets traded here in the next month. And then in the outfield, you're looking at the $25 million man still playing out in right, Jason Hayward. And then probably some combination of Happ, Bodie, and Phil Irvin, who's been brought in, probably making some kind of a rotation out of the other 2 outfield spots. So does that lineup feel to you like that there's going to be a lot of runs scored in this for this team?
I think fundamentally, this team is still missing its leadoff hitter. I would say that Hayward probably had maybe his best year for the Cubs last year, because I think it was the first time he had a significant on base percentage. But I don't think that Hayward's your leadoff hitter, and Happ is probably the other one getting on base a significant amount of the time. And I just don't see him as a leadoff hitter as well. I think the team's got to hit better than they hit last year. There were a lot of sub 250 batting averages on that team last year. And that certainly materialized itself once they met the Marlins, who were not exactly a scary playoff team.
No, but they literally just shut them out for 2 straight games. What was there? 1 run scored in those 2 games in the playoff exit. So
yeah,
looking at this team, the lineup seems underwhelming. The rotation and the bullpen seem to be built on sand rather than on stone. And so what do you feel like are realistic expectations for this team going into next season?
Well, I think some of that depends on what you see the other teams in the Central do. I don't think you've seen the Reds make any noise in the offseason. I don't think you've seen the Cardinals make much noise in the offseason. So sadly, I think this could be a very weak division. And I still don't see the Cubs coming out on top in it.
Well, so let's ask this question then. Let's say, for instance, that 88 wins could win you the NL Central. What would you assign as the probability of the Cubs achieving 88 wins with this roster as it's constructed?
If they make no other moves, I think there's a 10% chance or less that the Cubs win 88 games.
Okay. I think that's perfectly fair. I think that this team, as it's constructed now, being in basically rebuild mode, I think that the likely scenario is somewhere between 72 and 77 wins, honestly, if I had to peg it right now.
I think the best case scenario is that somehow the 2021 Cubs play like the Milwaukee Brewers.
Okay.
where you've got a bunch of no-name pitchers who somehow come together and pitch well enough. You know, that's what the Brewers have been doing for the last 3 years, right? They've got names that you possibly have not heard of, but they come out and they pitch well. Zach Davies is a big piece of that, right? If Zach Davies has a below 3 ERA again, like he did for the Padres, which I do not see happening, and Hendricks is Hendricks like, and Elzaleh shows the skills that he showed kind of in those final 2 months, and then if you get your 2016 Bryant and Rizzo and a 2020 version of Ian Happ, do I think this is a team that could find a way into the playoffs? Absolutely. Do I think that's the likely scenario? No.
So you're saying that the best case right now would be exhuming Don Zimmer and bringing the 89 Cubs back this season, where everything just kind of comes together. The Cardinals and Mets have a down year, and suddenly we're on top of the division.
Where I believe that you might get lucky with your starting pitching and your hitting, or everything just clicking, I just don't see that in the bullpen.
Yeah.
And I think by the time we've blown 6 saves in the first 2 months, that's going to get real old.
That's going to be real painful if that's the case.
Because let's be clear, 2 years ago, that's exactly what happened at the very end of the season with the Cardinals, where we had winnable games to catch them, and ultimately we lost them in late games. We lost that.
It cost Madden his job. I would say that final week of the season did more to cost Joe Madden his job than anything that had led up to it. So, all right. Well, shall we wrap this up with some final thoughts here tonight? Anything else that's particularly pressing you, thinking about the Cubs as they're constructed going into 2021?
I think that the thing that scares me is the very real possibility that Chris Bryant leaves the Chicago Cubs in free agency, and we get nothing in return for him. And he has no other than, the fact that he had the grievance against the Cubs. I think he's always been frustrated about how he was treated, and circumstances have not been ideal. And I just don't see there being any way that the Cubs pay what Bryant wants, or that Bryant accepts an offer with the Cubs. And so I think he's almost a guarantee to leave. So if you want anything for him, he's another player that needs to move this year. And when teams try to move players that everyone knows they need to get rid of, they don't always get the best return. So I'm very worried that Rizzo could be the lone holdover, and that's a sad way to go out in the last years of your career.
So you bring up an interesting point. This might be forgotten to some people, but they held Bryant back for a full month of the beginning of the 2015 season in order to set back his arbitration date and gain an extra year of control over his contract status. And now you're seeing the reaping what you sow with Bryant, where he's not willing to sign a long-term deal with the Cubs. So, all right. Well, thank you for your thoughts today, Matt. We're going to sign off, and we will call this a podcast.